So welcome back along. It's me, Alex, here again with another video on analyzing a recent past situation. And what we've been trying to do with these videos so far is look at like some of the things that led us up to this point. We've looked at the failures of the Corbyn project, and now we're going to be looking at something else that is, which I think the rulers of Britain would prefer to stay buried in terms of what we're going to be discussing today. And that's the Kosovo War of 1999. And to discuss this with us, we've got joining us today, Kit Klarenberg. Kit, do you mind introducing yourself to the people and telling them a little bit about what you do in your work?
Oh, sure. Okay. Well, I mean, in short, I'm an investigative journalist looking at the role of intelligence services in shaping politics and perceptions in the UK and abroad.
And you're actually based out in Serbia, aren't you?
Yes, sunny Serbia, where it's presently 30 degrees, and there are frequent pro-Russian protests in the streets. Rather different to the UK, I think, at the moment.
Well, yes. Here we get distinguished former BBC journalists such as Paul Mason leading pro-war demonstrations outside the Ministry of Defence.
Oh yes, no, he threatened a friend of mine. She suggested he might be working for MI5, and he sent her a letter saying, "Give me your contact details so I can sue you for libel."
Yes,
on her birthday, no less. I mean, what a scumbag!
Yes, I believe I know the person you're referring to, because she sent me the message that Paul Mason sent to her. Yes, he was leading a pro-war demo outside the MOD and encouraging the MOD civil servants to come and join them in this pro-war demonstration.
Yeah, it's an interesting feature, isn't it, of all of these anti-war demonstrations? They have all of these people calling for no-fly zones and for NATO intervention. Just that's not anti-war at all, is it?
Well, no, not really. I think there's some basic cognitive dissonance going on there. But anyway, so I wanted to talk to you today, Kit, about the very interesting article you wrote a while ago now for Sputnik regarding the Kosovo War. And I wanted to talk specifically about this because in the run-up to the current stage of the war in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin actually makes specific reference to the example of Kosovo many different times. And he made reference to it again in the discussion he had this week with the UN Secretary General Guterres. And when Guterres was trying to argue that it wasn't legitimate for Putin to arbitrarily recognize the republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, and then Putin throws back at him, well, you, as in the American-led so-called international community, have arbitrarily recognized Kosovo, and you ripped it out of Serbia. And he's mentioned this on many different occasions. So I thought, given that the issues around so-called responsibility to protect, which is a feature of international law that's been rather big over the last few years. And a lot of the arguments around so-called humanitarian intervention from the West stem from this period and this region of the world and the actions of Britain and America back in 1999. So why don't we start our discussion by if you can just outline, like, what was the status of Yugoslavia as a nation or a collection of states in 1999, and like what was going on then?
Okay, well, I mean, at one point, Yugoslavia was a kind of region-spanning, multi-state federation, in effect. It was created in the wake of World War I from the remnants of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then in the wake of World War II, it became a communist state, but it was, it was non-aligned. It maintained positive relations with both Moscow and the West to varying degrees. But in the 1980s, an effort to effectively break up Yugoslavia began, and come 1991, it was broken up into several republics. So by 1999. It was primarily composed of Serbia, but then also Montenegro, and there was effectively or theoretically autonomous province known as Kosovo in the south. At one stage, it was the capital of Serbia, and it was and remains regarded to this day by the vast majority of Serbs as the kind of the cradle of Serbian civilization. And it was here that Serbia defeated, or the Serbs defeated, the Ottoman Empire, and this gives Serbia its national motto, which is "Only unity will save the Serbs," and they very much see themselves as having protected Europe from the rampaging Ottomans. So it's a very fundamental part of their kind of history and culture. However, it's always had, for centuries, it's had a large Albanian Muslim population. And in the 1980s, there was, sorry, you know, you can cut stuff out later.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, sorry. In the 1980s, there was effectively its status as an autonomous province was rather truncated. So effectively, schools were no longer allowed to teach, you know, in Albanian, and there were all sorts of, you know, kind of, I mean, you know, discriminatory measures were imposed, and it's around this time that the Kosovo Liberation Army, which is effectively a, you know, Islamic extremist movement, which aimed to create a greater Albania, starts to germinate. So yes, by 1999, Yugoslavia is rather rather pathetically reduced from its original size. It's been subject to pretty grinding sanctions for the preceding decade, and also it expended, you know, an enormous amount of blood and treasure fighting, you know, kind of civil wars against republics to prevent them breaking away.
So it's a truncated version of the original state by 1999. It's also a state that's now run by a figure who was, before Putin, before Saddam Hussein, before many others, there was Slobodan Milosevic, the demon of the week in the British press, from the mid-90s to the early to 2000. Can you talk a little bit about him and like what kind of politics did he actually represent, and the kind of regime he was actually running, rather than the sort of cartoon figure we were presented with in the West?
Well, sure. I mean, so effectively, Milosevic was the West guy. Like he was effectively handpicked by Western powers, you know, in particular Germany and the US, because he was a banker, and it was thought that he would implement neoliberal, you know, reforms, bringing it more in line with Europe, and then it has been admitted by, you know, senior NATO officials that it was Yugoslavia's resistance to the wider economic trends in the region that precipitated its downfall. But so essentially, you know, Yugoslavia by about 91 had a mixed economy. So it was, you know, part market. There was a degree of Western capital penetration, but it also maintained, you know, very extensive welfare protection. So, you know, education, housing, and indeed employment were all considered human rights. It had, yes, it was, you know, full employment, with, you know, a significant significant protections for the working population, and essentially, come the early 90s, you have the collapse of the Soviet Union and the breakup of the Warsaw Pact countries. It was felt that Yugoslavia would go this way too, and yes, that, you know, Milosevic would be the person to deliver that. And then effectively, the US passed what's called the Foreign Appropriations Act, which was a bit of legislation which effectively called for there to be independence referendums and elections held in all of the Yugoslavian republics, and it would be cut off from any and all trade and aid with the US if it didn't if it didn't go along with it. And so that it was believed that that he would come in and destroy all of the social infrastructure and privatize but then that didn't happen. And as a result, of course, in such as the manner of these things, suddenly human rights abuses start getting there are allegations of human rights abuses and issues around free speech and all this other kind of very common refrains about enemy countries start circulating, and he was successfully pressured as a result into conducting a large number of democratic reforms. And by the time that the bombing started in 1999, by law, every single opposition party in Serbia had its own newspaper and radio station. There were more opposition parties in Serbia's parliament than any other European country, and he was governing in a coalition government. And what's more as well is that for all of this, this kind of notion that, that he gave as this absolutely brutal dictator, that frequently he actually would talk the Yugoslavian kind of, military chiefs down from conducting offensive operations. There's a very good documentary. It's somewhat slanted, but it's quite revealing, called "The Death of Yugoslavia," which was public. It was broadcast in the 90s on the BBC. Nothing like that would ever get made or broadcast now. And there are, frequently it crops up that actually that there were significant attempts to provoke Serbia into, and we'll get into more of this later, into aggressive responses by breakaway movements, and Milosevic frequently forbade the military from responding, because I think that he knew what was happening and he knew what the desired end game was.
So Milosevic is regarded in the early years, in his early days, as the Americans and the Germans' guy. But from what you're saying, he then tries to essentially undergo a process whereby he preserved Yugoslavia and put it on an independent development path, shall we say. His idea was probably in line with like what you might call the development of a market economy, but with a strong role for the state, because he was smart enough to know that if they just essentially threw open the borders and allowed foreign capital in, it would essentially destroy Yugoslav industry and asset strip the place. And so he had in mind some kind of system which preserved bits of the old system, and that was what was unacceptable to the Americans, the Germans, and the British.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's an interesting comparison to make is Bulgaria, which has since it used to actually be a fairly wealthy country, wealthier than several Western European states under communism, and then in 1989 there was the process of privatization, the destruction of the welfare state and social protections began, and its membership of NATO was made contingent on it breaking up its state tobacco and telecom firms. A bit odd, joining a military alliance, but you need to sell Marlboros in return. And it's the effectively, it's still there are still privatizations and quote unquote reforms ongoing because its economy stubbornly refuses to grow. All of every quote unquote reform has just actually damaged its economy and the finances of its citizens, and the response is always, well, you haven't gone far enough. So yeah, I mean, I think that this had already was well underway across the former Eastern Bloc by the mid 90s, and I think that Milosevic could see exactly what was what would happen if he threw open the doors. So any right thinking or morally upstanding person wouldn't allow that to happen.
And so hence his elevation into demon of the week in the press, basically. Like there was a decision made somewhere in London, Washington, Berlin, that this guy had to go. And so would it be correct in saying that they identified Kosovo as a means to which, as a lever of pressure upon Milosevic to essentially cause the collapse of his government ultimately?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Kosovo had been of, enormous interest to the Western powers for a very long time, because it is a very resource-rich region. It's rife with gold and copper and other precious metals. There is in North Mitrovica, which is Mitrovica is the city in Kosovo in the north, and it is effectively split between a Serbian north and an Albanian south. It has one bridge connecting the two halves of the city, which there are concrete barricades preventing people from crossing. I mean, presenting cards from crossing, and there are lots of armed NATO troops milling around. I've travelled around there extensively. It's very, very interesting. You have to change your currency when you go over go over the bridge and all this other stuff. And there's anti-NATO graffiti everywhere, and posters of Vladimir Putin in profusion in the street. But I mean, the reason I mention this is because there is a large Spomenic. There were these statues that were created all over Yugoslavia in the wake of World War II, kind of commemorating communist victory. And there is a huge, a huge statue of a mine, like a kind of mining car. And this is to commemorate a joint Kosovan and Serbian partisan mission to blow up the Stari Trig mining complex, which was at the time providing the vast bulk of the material used in Nazi U-boat batteries. So yeah, it was considered a very, very, very valuable, coveted bit of real estate, and it was all of its industry was nationalized, and there were controls on the cost of exports and indeed the wages of people who work there, and to say the least, the Western powers wanted to get their hands on it. But yeah, I think as far as an issue goes, to exploit, it was a very, very useful one, because there was discrimination towards the Albanian population, and it became something that was very, very easy to wrap this up as a kind of a human rights concern, and once this narrative was minted, then it was very, very easy to claim that a massacre was impending, and therefore you need to intervene. And leading up to this, there had been numerous kind of bogus conciliation attempts by the Western powers. So there's the Rambouillet Accords, which was I think this is in 1999. This was a proposal by NATO to allow for Serbia to allow the stationing of 30,000 NATO troops in Kosovo permanently, their freedom to travel wherever they liked in the principality, but also their immunity from Serbian law. And again, no sane, rational person would ever go along with this. And it was, Henry Kissinger of all people said that it was, a disgusting document, and that yes, that it was that no quote unquote angelic Serb would ever accept. And then the State Department subsequently admitted that yes, that they set a ludicrously high bar, and that by Serbia refusing to accept it, they could say that they're refusing a diplomatic solution, and yeah, it provided one justification of many for the 78-day bombing campaign in the country.
So I remember, Kosovo is kind of the first big news event I can clearly remember, and
me too.
Yeah, I remember the Rambouillet talks were just before the bombing started. And it was portrayed as that Milosevic had laid down a load of unreasonable propositions, and this, what you've just explained, was never, as far as I can remember, ever explained at the time on the BBC, ITN, etc. It was portrayed that Milosevic had walked out of negotiations because he was hell-bent on creating this entity known as Greater Serbia. But in actual fact, what you're saying is that it was the US, British, and others who essentially put forward a whole bunch of unreasonable demands, knowing full well that Milosevic couldn't possibly agree to it, because even if he wanted to, then his military men might have just cooed him out anyway if he had.
Yeah, and I think as well that it's just that, yeah, I mean, absolutely, but it's a recurrent feature of a lot of the most of the kind of the Yugoslavian agreements. So, for instance, in Bosnia, where there was, a very, very brutal war, which the West supported by supplying arms to the Bosnian Muslim opposition, and also ferrying in a large number of Mujahideen fighters from Afghanistan. And I mean, I've actually got an article coming on this, but there are some declassified cables from a Canadian UN peacekeeping force where they specifically talk about how, oh well, yeah, the Bosnian Muslims are, whenever they go into peace negotiations, their position is, well, give us everything we want, or we're just going to carry on fighting. And then, because they had the US's, unconditional, unlimited backing, they knew that they could get away with not, offering any, not offering any solution or behaving in a constructive manner. And then, again, this is reported at the time as, oh, well, the Serbs, they're playing hardball, they're completely unreasonable. But then, if the negotiating position of your opponent is, well, we just want everything that we want and we're not budging, and we're going to carry on killing until we get what we want. I mean, there's no, there is no diplomatic solution there, really, is there? And so, yeah, there was this, again, there's this wider narrative of Serbian/Yugoslavian intransigence and brutality. I meet people to this day who are utterly convinced that the Serbs are somehow, genetically, but violent, dangerous people. In reality, they're amongst the kindest, most considerate and friendly people you could ever meet. Despite the fact that you can walk around Belgrade to this day, there are bombed out buildings, remnants from the bombing campaign. There are frequently homeless veterans missing legs and arms because as part of the Yugoslavian surrender, its military was not allowed to claim military pensions. So a large amount of unemployed and homeless veterans, and yeah, there was absolutely no way that that anything other than the effective annexation of Kosovo, that was the proposition, and I think that because the Serbs had the temerity to stand up to this, there was a perceived need to be excessively cruel to them, to teach them a lesson, and to teach other countries thinking of not complying with the US will.
Well, I remember from the coverage at the time, the what you said about the Serbs being portrayed as almost demons was common, and this was in the Guardian, in the Independent, and the liberal press, and also some of the left groups, some of those same left groups who are having pro-war demonstrations right now, actually. Were going along with all of this. So let's look at then the Kosovo Liberation Army, or the KLA, who were, your article, you described them as basically the chosen weapon of the United States, Germany, Britain. So by 1999, who are they? What's their composition, and is there any way of gauging what level of support they actually had within the Kosovan Albanian population?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're effectively, this was a group that was trained and amassed in the kind of the vast mountains that surround of Albania. I mean, it's just it's much like Afghanistan. It's a series of small villages and towns and cities that are separated by these vast rock formations, and so essentially they were designated by 1998 as a terrorist group by the State Department, and they had very close connections with Al Qaeda. They received funding from the drugs trade, from Osama bin Laden, their mission, if you can call it that, was to create a greater Albania. And this is the notion that effectively Albania, after World War I, lost some of its territory it had after it broke away from the Ottoman Empire in 1912. And this would comprise, parts of Montenegro, parts of Serbia, parts of Macedonia. And yeah, they were known to for excessive violence. And for targeting civilians, and so I mean it's quite extraordinary to think that that in not long ago, in Europe there were frequent, almost daily kind of assassinations of public officials and bombing attacks you know, it was like the Troubles, but you know, with an even higher degree of violence. And yes, the civilians were the primary victims of that. And yeah, this was a very deliberate strategy, because it was known that, of course, you know, when you start killing, you know, policemen and politicians and civilians, then there's going to be a brutal response from authorities. And they were, you know, the Hashim Thaçi, who was a KLA chief who subsequently became you know, Prime Minister and President of Kosovo, and was recently indicted for war crimes, despite, you know, his autobiography has a large quote from Joe Biden on the front cover, referring to how he's a courageous freedom fighter.
Joe can sure pick winners, can't he?
I'm sorry?
Joe Biden can always pick a winner.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that, yeah, so essentially, you know, he's admitted that, yes, that, you know, we were deliberately trying to provoke an adverse reaction, because, you know, we'd effectively been told by the West that, like, once you hit a certain number of deaths and a certain kind of level of repression from authorities, then we can start making a big stink about this and talking about, you know, talking about human rights and, you know, offering self-righteous condemnations in the UN and that sort of thing. So yeah, they were, yeah, it was a large group. It had about 30,000. It had about 30,000 members by the end of the start of 99. But then equally, you know, it was not all of the, and far from a majority of the local population actually supported them. And I think, you know, they were seen as, they were just seen as these kind of brutal criminals by a large proportion of the population. You know, the Yugoslavia in general, and, you know, Serbia even today prides itself on, you know, kind of mutual cohabitation between different religions, different ethnicities. There is, you know, frequently you will find you know, mosques and churches and even synagogues in the same street, and, you know, you see kind of Jews and Muslims and Christians just, you know, hanging out together, drinking coffee and smoking. It's a very popular Serb activity, smoking, to this day. But and, you know, there was significant condemnation by religious leaders of, you know, their attacks on civilians. So they certainly didn't represent you know, the majority of the population, and in fact, you know, they would specifically target Kosovan Albanians who they felt were insufficiently enthusiastic. You know, if say a community leader was opposed, you know, they would potentially be in significant trouble. So yeah, I mean, yeah, there was this kind of ragtag criminal group with, you know, recognized as terrorists by the State Department, and you know, even, you know, condemned by the British Foreign Secretary, while the British support to the KLA was free-flowing, you know, funds and arms and training by the SAS was being provided. They were being criticized. Their Greater Albania strategy was being criticised in Parliament by the Foreign Secretary, and indeed, you know, Tony Blair was openly denying that there was any British support for the KLA, even when it was, you know, very easily provable, and even the media was referring to the KLA as effectively, you know, Britain's eyes and ears and fighters on the ground.
And they had an extensive relationship, as you said, not just with the Afghan Mujahideen, with Al Qaeda, and this was all under the supervision of the CIA, MI6, and the German intelligence services as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think that the role of the BMD is very interesting, because I think that they don't get, I mean, maybe it's a language thing, but they don't get nearly enough, you know, attention and focus and, as, say, you know, the CIA or like the, you know, MI6.
And the BND is the German external foreign intelligence service, isn't it? Like,
yes,
yes, their MI6.
Yeah, it's the equivalent of the CIA and MI6, but they don't get nearly enough attention. So they were heavily involved in the breakup of Yugoslavia. You know, they were training Croatian paramilitaries and you know, providing funds and weapons to a variety of breakaway forces, and, you know, in a rather sinister kind of historical synergy. It was often that these people were the descendants of collaborationists with whom Nazi Germany had used as leaders. Slovenia became a formal part of the Third Reich, and Croatia was run by a fascist puppet government, and so again that was their significant interest in kind of almost regaining these areas that they once occupied. It's rather troubling, but essentially they were heavily involved. And it also effectively in the 90s and to this day, the Balkans became overrun by spooks from numerous, including the DGSE, which is France, the French Foreign Intelligence Service, and some all of these different agencies and operatives were sometimes working together, sometimes working against each other. It got to the point where they were frequently being exposed, that their actions were so brazen and open, they were frequently being exposed in the press, and you're having to flee from the respective countries in which they were operating. To this day, often when you in the Balkans, if English is your first language, they often assume that you're a spy, which is actually probably quite a good bet. But yeah, so you have all of these different agencies funneling arms and weapons and providing training to the KLA, and it's just when it was known that they were carrying out absolutely horrific atrocities, which were being condemned by a significant proportion of the population, and even other other kind of Kosovo independence activists thought that their tactics and strategy was deplorable and potentially counterproductive. Despite the fact that all of this was known, it was very public that the US had designated them, a terrorist group. I mean, they were again largely, presented in the media as these kind of courageous freedom fighters who were, fighting back against tyranny.
Yeah, funny how the story doesn't change. I mean, you could apply all of that to our friends in Ukraine right now, the Azov battalion, right sector, people like that. It's the same arguments and a lot of the same tactics being used by those organizations that were tried out with the KLA and others in Yugoslavia. So really it could be argued, couldn't it, that the Yugoslav wars were a kind of opening stage to really the US actions over the last 30 years, couldn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's but what's interesting, what I find very interesting is that they used the effective blueprint that was set by the destruction of Yugoslavia. They've started, I think, around 2014. They started using that exact same model to try and take down Putin, or potentially even balkanize Russia, and it hasn't actually worked. And it's interesting that there's a very good friend of mine who's Serbian, who said in 2015, he told me that they're doing the exact same thing that they did to us. And it was well understood. It was well understood that what was afoot, and that things were only going to ramp up significantly thereafter. And I mean, it's just it's incredible to me as well that you can even find clips online of British media coverage on the ground in places like Mariupol, where citizens were being slaughtered by the Ukrainian army, and they're telling interviewers, our government is killing us, and then there is zero trace or recognition of the fact that these people lived under absolutely brutal oppression and kind of almost daily shelling for 8 years. It's the evil Russians are poking their nose where they have no business being.
Well, Putin said in the run-up to the Russian incursion into Ukraine in the latest stage of this 8-year war that he said directly to a reporter from Britain that the MI6 had been involved in Chechnya over 20 years ago, and that the plans of the United States and their allies was to essentially shatter the country. And he quoted an advisor to Woodrow Wilson from back 100 years ago, saying that Russia was too big to exist, basically, and caused too many problems. And so and of course it has, Russia, a myriad of different nationalities, ethnicities, religious groups within it, all of which it seems that the Americans and the British are trying to do a Kosovo on. But it seems that, would you agree with the idea that they settled on Eastern Ukraine as the most effective lever to use against Moscow in this case, to replicate what they did in Kosovo?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's, there's what's very interesting is that the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a US government regime change agency, and its own president has admitted that we do publicly what the CIA used to do covertly, which is you sponsor opposition groups, you fund your opposition media outlets to undermine governments you don't like, and you effectively create this shadow structure of activists who can be activated to stir up trouble when a government doesn't act as required by the US. And so in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the NED removed all records of its grants provided to Ukraine, and I mean it had given, I think since 2014, it had given 22 million was spent on propaganda efforts. But you can still dig up those records via the Wayback Machine, and it's all about but there's a significant proportion of that funding was on. Was given to NGOs and media outlets documenting, atrocities, quote unquote, carried out by Russian forces, or indeed the kind of Russian-speaking separatists. There's not a penny of funding was provided to any organization documenting Ukrainian government atrocities. And so we have had for 8 years, we have had this completely, one-sided and utterly distorted version of reality. There has been, the Russian involvement in the East, hitherto, prior to February 24th, was extremely limited. And actually, I think Putin was consistently careful Putin's been consistently careful to
he's limited their involvement.
Putin has been consistently careful to limit Russian involvement. In fact, actually, the Kremlin has frequently clashed with the separatists, because many of the separatists, both kind of local and whatever kind of Russian freelancers have joined, very much believed in this Novorossiya idea of like this kind of new Russia, and the Kremlin has been opposed to that, and specifically has changed the rebel leadership as a result. And then within Russia itself, there has been a huge for many years, it's been enormous domestic pressure, both by the public, a significant proportion of the public, but also the Russian military and I would say the Russian intelligence services as well, for more fully fledged decisive involvement in the war. And from about 2016 onwards, and they never got any media coverage at all, which is interesting. There are these very large protests in Moscow and other major cities by people who were, harshly condemnatory of the very limited support being given, and they saw it as this as a betrayal. And these protests were vast. They aligned communists, liberals, nationalists, and they were, I would imagine, that they were seen as a significant threat to Putin's rule. The perspective from the Kremlin was that this is quite dangerous, much more threatening than say Alexei Navalny could ever be. You see it now. Westerners wouldn't see it because all Russian media is effectively illegalized and banned. But there have been opposition politicians and indeed journalists who have very publicly said what since the war started, what took them so long You know, it's shocking that that they waited, you know, so many years, you know, conducting these clearly pointless, you know, diplomatic discussions when, you know, the only option really was a fully fledged invasion.
Well, that's what is never covered here. Like in Britain, if you only watch BBC or ITN, you would think that Alexei Navalny was going to be the next president of Russia, even though his support, from what I can gather, is limited to certain more middle-class circles in St. Petersburg, Moscow, and maybe some of the other major urban centers. Whereas in actual fact, the real opposition to Putin, the dangerous opposition to Putin, comes from this alliance, as you put it, from everybody from liberals to the Russian Communist Party, who all agree in agreement that he's not gone far enough. That he's essentially, I look at the Russian Telegram channels and follow some of the more prominent Russian nationalists, like that fellow Igor Strelkov, who was a FSB guy who was in eastern Ukraine in 2014-15. They're all basically saying that Putin's a coward and that he's not going far enough. And when are we going to clean these clowns out of the Kremlin and get some real men in there? So like the fantasy that some sort of 90s liberal is going to reemerge again is just, it's fan fiction, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, Strelkov was one of the rebel leaders who was effectively forcibly switched out by the Kremlin, because yes, he was a very passionate believer in this Novorossiya project, which the Kremlin was absolutely not on board with. The Minsk Accords, and it's just I thought I could no longer be surprised by mainstream media misreporting, but I mean, I saw some article the other day that was talking about how Minsk was all the Minsk Accords were always just a way intended as a kind of battering ram for Putin's imperial ambitions, and they were drawn up specifically to further Putin's agenda. Russia was not only not part of the negotiations on Minsk, it refused to be part of them. It didn't want to get involved. It was very happy with the result because it effectively, if it had been enforced, it would have ensured autonomy for the breakaway republics within Ukraine. Russia did not want to take these regions on and absorb them. I mean, I would imagine at least in part because they knew that this would be framed as somehow heinous imperial like echoes of the Nazis marching into Vienna. Effectively, those accords were brokered by France, Germany, and Ukraine. They were seen by the kind of more ideological rebels as effectively a betrayal, but they kind of had little choice but to go along with it. But then the Ukraine did not adhere to the ceasefire at any point that effectively imposed. It did not hold elections, open elections. It didn't provide any autonomy to those regions at all. And it's like there's an enormous amount of kind of internal anger that that Russia sat by for 8 years, saying, please, can you adhere to this accord that you voluntarily signed up to? Zelensky was elected by a landslide on a platform of improving relations with Russia and implementing the Minsk Accords, and then then again best part of 3 years of this not being done, and meanwhile almost every day people civilians are being killed.
Well, that reminds me of the comment you made about the Bosnian Muslim side, the Bosnian Muslim leadership under, I believe it was Alija Izetbegovic back in the day, going in and basically saying, we demand everything, we give up nothing. I mean, in the translation here, I think, and I'd be anxious to get your thoughts on this, would be that as of right sector, the other more militant end, they don't feel like they need to compromise at all, because even with the Zelensky, because they have ultimately the United States, the British, and others standing behind them. And they know that whatever the elected leadership of Ukraine says, it doesn't matter. because the Azov leaders know very well their value to the West. And I think Max Blumenthal covered it, and Aaron Mate did with this guy, Andrei Porubi, talking about their value to the making of the Maidan. So what would be your thoughts on that comparison?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that this is something else that's been lost, was that effectively, pre-2014, nationalists, the kind of, anti-Russian nationalists, were very much a fringe movement that was limited to the west of Ukraine. When the Maidan protests kicked off, what was actually really striking, and again, it was never acknowledged in the mainstream media, was that I think it was only about 20% of protesters were protesting due to democratic and human rights concerns. And actually, the protesters never had a majority. They never had majority support amongst the public. So, and in part that was because it had a significant and very loud nationalist component, and they're effectively ever since then, they've been the ones in charge. These people who do not represent the majority of the public, and indeed, hold very violent and aggressive views towards Russians and indeed Russia. The Azov and particularly its leadership subscribes to this notion that Russia is effectively overrun and indeed is effectively secretly controlled by Jews, and that Putin is Jewish and blah 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 blah. Very kind of classic. Behind every partisan and Bolshevik is a Jew. That Hitler's perspective. So yeah, I mean, but they know that they have the unconditional support of the West. So of course, they're never ever going to play ball. There are videos that my friend and colleague Alex Rubinstein has reported on of Zelensky visiting these people in person and looking genuinely really upset when he was saying like, please stop fighting, and they're just like, no. And because they've effectively been in charge of Azov and various other kind of right-wing groups have served as the effective police forces of eastern Ukraine, and have subjected civilians to absolutely brutal oppression, and there have been zero consequences to their actions. They've never been condemned. The cash and the funding has kept flowing. Several far-right Ukrainian groups have received training at elite Western military academies. There was a report on this published by this think tank that was part of George Washington University, exposing how this one Centuria. This one group, there's posted all over Facebook of them, very happily attending shooting ranges at Sandringham in the UK, and then they've got like swastika tattoos and all this other stuff, and then this report was completely buried and ignored in a way which I think a similar report on Nazism in Russia, which of course does exist, would get absolutely blanket coverage. It's really quite extraordinary. So they know very well that there's nothing that the state can do, and I think that actually as well that Zelensky's life would have very much been at risk if he tried to forcibly implement the Minsk Accords. There was an interview he gave towards the end of last year, which I thought was very interesting, where he was talking about. He seemed very scared, and he was effectively talking about how he had reason to believe that the Russians were going to assassinate him or replace him. And he struck me as someone, he seemed someone who was very scared, not about what he was actually talking about. And I would suggest, that words have been had with him privately. That if you give in to Russian demands, and if you do provide autonomy, or at least the basic decency to the breakaway republics, then you're going to die, and potentially in an extremely horrible fashion, as of known for.
As a former civil servant myself, I think the phrase that maybe a Foreign Office person would use would be, well, sir, we cannot guarantee your safety.
Yes, indeed. Or it's like Bill Hicks's joke about how, you know, when a president gets elected, they get shown a video of the JFK assassination from an angle that's never been seen, publicly before.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's, you know, and again, it's just, you know, the fact that Zelensky's Jewish is frequently cited as, you know, as evidence that, like, you know, Ukraine isn't overrun by, you know, violent nationalists. But it's like, I mean, it doesn't really, you know, you know, the US had Barack Obama as a president for 8 years. I mean, and it doesn't mean that it's not a racist country. It's a farce really. And actually, I think as well that, you know, again, the kind of sophistry and apology is that, oh yes, well, there are Nazis in Russia too. It just completely overlooks the fact that, well, you know, there aren't Nazis in the Russian government, and there aren't Nazis in the Russian, you know, dedicated Nazi battalion in the Russian military with enormous clout and influence, you know, over domestic politics. You know, Russia has a ban on, you know, on public displays of the swastika, and you know, you know, media outlets are actually even restricted in their ability to, you know, refer to Nazis openly, and they always have to add a caveat. And, you know, news outlets always have to add a caveat in articles stating, oh well, you know, Nazism is banned in Russia by law. So which is, you know, a very different situation to Ukraine, where, you know, people openly display swastikas and boastfully too.
Well, this is the thing. It's like you don't need, it's said that in Ukraine, and this again will throw back to Yugoslavia as well, you don't actually need a huge number of guys organized to actually control a society via terror. All you need really is a few thousand men who are dedicated, well armed, and brutal enough, and you can run an area on terror for a little while at least. And I think this is, from my understanding of it, this is what happened with a lot of the breakaways in Yugoslavia. Like, there was some sort of nationalist sentiment, but certainly the ultra-violent collapse of the state and the imposition of new ones was something that was seems to have been the creation of relatively small armed groups that were able to act because there wasn't any real effective organized opposition to them, and they had powerful backers from the outside.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's, you know, there's that Lenin quote, it might be apocryphal, but, you know, one man with a gun can control 100 without one. And I said, yeah, and it also as well, you know, even in you know, acting as this kind of, you know, excessively violent, you know, police force, you know, almost, you know, very, very ISIS-like. And what's, you know, what's actually really troubling is that, you know, a key Zelensky advisor has spoken about, you know, approvingly and, you know, admiringly of ISIS, stating, you know, that everything they do is very well thought out, including the level of cruelty. And so, yeah, that when you there are areas of, you know, Mariupol is a very classic example, where areas where of eastern Ukraine, where, you know, Azov would drive around in unmarked cars, jump out, like, you know, drag people in off the street, and then just, you know, brutally torture them. And then, you know, when you create this like permanent state of fear, and it's you know, similar things have happened in western Ukraine. You know, Kiev handed over, you know, gave a contract to, you know, C-18, which is this violent racist street gang, to, you know, to act as a private police force, and then they duly went around, you know, brutally attacking LGBT people, and you know, tearing down Roma camps and all this other stuff. But again, none of this leaks out. And, you know, even you know, I think the Guardian, they had this they had this article, they published an article about, you know, a gay pride parade in Kiev, and it was talking about how, you know, this is a demonstration of how liberal and, you know, kind of, you know, and worldly Ukraine has become, you know, as a quote unquote independent democracy. And buried at the very bottom, they had the reference to the fact that, you know, dozens of people had been arrested with like grenades and, and guns who were like, you know, attempting to disrupt the parade, and that the fact that, you know, it was necessary to have a huge military presence to prevent violence breaking out and stuff. So yeah, I mean, like so much of the stuff is for show, and yes, it would be organisations like NED and other the UK Foreign Office has been heavily involved in kind of domestic and international propaganda campaigns around Ukraine. Funnily enough, they were even the British were even involved in running a PR campaign to sell a new employment law, which would effectively destroy the rights of working Ukrainians, and was deeply unpopular and had been slammed by international labour organisations as extremely bad, and yet they hired consultants to sell it to people. And I think any reasonable person would ask, why are the British doing this in Ukraine? And yeah, the answer is that it has effectively been a Western colony and run in Western interest through typically through force and guile, and by embracing by the covert or even overt embrace of the most kind of nationalistic, fascistic elements on the ground.
Well, that leads us neatly to a look at what happened to Kosovo and Serbia after the 78-day bombing campaign to bring this discussion into a close, because the aftermath of the campaign saw ultimately, after 78 days and a lot of destruction within Serbia itself and Kosovo, and of course the expulsion of the Kosovan Albanian population, which followed the start of that bombing campaign. Ultimately, Milosevic does give in with conditions around the Russian involvement in the so-called peacekeeping force inside Kosovo itself. So can you talk a little bit about the end of that, and also what was the nature of the so-called settlement that was imposed upon Kosovo and Serbia at the end of that bombing campaign?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think that this is interesting, that you can find footage of this online, that there are Russia intervened in the country and effectively blocked the KLA and indeed NATO forces from going any further. They were trying to push ahead, and there is a senior British military official who is on record as saying he was ordered by the US to open fire on the Russians, and his response was, "I'm not starting World War III for you." So I think that essentially the terms of the surrender were extremely harsh, as I alluded to earlier. The entire Yugoslavian military was prohibited from claiming a military pension or any benefits otherwise. Its economy, which had already been strangled, was subject to the country was subject to significant reparations and all sorts of other kind of harsh punitive measures. And then Kosovo itself effectively became this small statelet within Serbia, which it's for the best part of 10 years it had this uncertain status, whereby to this day Serbia claims it as a part of its country and its state. It is referred to as such in Serbia's constitution, but then it used the euro. Serb currency was not accepted in the vast majority of the country. It was heavily occupied with scores of NATO quote unquote peacekeepers, and then in 2008 it declared itself an independent state, which was it did not go down well at all in Serbia and amongst Serbians. And I've spoken to military veterans who state one day we're going to take it back. So it is quite clearly there is there's not closure on this from the Serbian side. And I think that yes, that the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has significantly boosted anti-Western, anti-NATO, and anti-EU sentiment in the country, because in common with many other parts of the former Yugoslavia, there is an aggressive push to get these countries into the EU and into NATO, despite often significant local opposition. So it's like in Montenegro, they're about 30%. They joined in 2017, and it's NATO is supported by about 30% of the country. 98% of Bosnian Serbs oppose NATO membership. Something like 80% of Serbs, or if not more now, oppose NATO membership. But then them joining is considered a fait accompli by Western leaders, and it's the same with, again, the similar thing in Ukraine, where it's like actually a majority of the population did not support NATO membership. It's probably very different now, but and it's just this is not something in the equation. It's just like, right, well, I mean, if these countries don't actually want to join these structures, why why is it being opposed upon them? Why is it this huge issue? And with the pundits and journalists and politicians very self-righteously declaring that, oh well, Ukraine as a sovereign country has this inalienable right to join military structures, but when they don't actually want to join it in the first place. It's very, very, very curious, and I think that often, and we see this in various parts of the former Yugoslavia, the West has backed very brutal, autocratic, undemocratic leaders who are opposed to who are opposed to freedom of the press and and even elections themselves, in order to because ultimately they further Western interests. And you hear not the slightest condemnation of their human rights records at all. These two things might be related.
Oh yes, and so the state of Kosovo now is basically that of a Western or US-led protectorate, essentially.
And it is effectively a colony, and it's very interesting. I would recommend that everyone should go there. It's very beautiful and it's extremely cheap. But effectively, it is heavily occupied by US troops and British troops and military bases. There is a giant statue of Bill Clinton with massive hands. There are numerous streets. There are numerous streets named after US officials. I think that there's a Madeleine Albright Avenue. Madeleine Albright was obviously someone who said that the death of 500,000 Iraqi children was through US sanctions was a price worth paying, and that she called for she was fundamental to the bombing campaign in against Yugoslavia. She's hated. There were street parties when she died recently in Belgrade, and she actually also as well profited significantly from the privatization of major industries in Kosovo. But its status remains remains highly uncertain. So as I said, when you head into the north, there are, which the Foreign Office states is very dangerous, but actually I even found that people are very friendly and forthcoming and usually quite curious that the Westerners traveling around there. But they in effect it is a dual system where they have their own police force, despite EU efforts to harmonise the two parts of Kosovo. That's not really worked. There is. It's a kind of unending debate because Serbia very much sees sees it as still part of its own territory, and there have been numerous attempts to secure closure on the issue over the years. Some proposal for where the Serbian majority portions of Kosovo would be traded for Albanian majority parts of Serbia, but this has not really gotten anywhere. And again, I think that ultimately Kosovo's political class know that we have the unconditional backing of the US, so why should we give you anything? And it just maintains this kind of very strict, this kind of completely unsustainable limbo, which is never really talked about, apart from when there's the occasional flare up of violence, as there was in October last year. There was which erupted because Kosovo stopped recognizing Serbia. The bulk of Kosovo stopped recognizing Serbian number plates, and and that was a major source of contention.
And the effect on Serbia itself of the bombing campaign, and ultimately what looks like an early example of a color revolution to remove Milosevic in 2000, a year after this concluded. Can you talk a little bit about the fall of Milosevic and like how that was it in essence the work of like an early example of a color revolution going on there?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's again, it's as if Serbia's nose hadn't been rubbed in shit sufficiently. In 2000. Milosevic was effectively deposed, and it was via the National Endowment for Democracy. I think it was something like, even in the span of just 1 year, the NED spent tens of millions of dollars on funding opposition groups. There was the primary one was called Otpor, which means resist, and they coated Serbia in anti-Milosevic graffiti, published all of these anti-Milosevic creeds, and he'd been elected twice as the president of Yugoslavia and once as the president of Serbia, and he was still very, very popular. And the West chosen candidate was the pro-Western kind of US groom candidate was so hated that they ended up having to back a nationalist who, funnily enough, was still on a platform of criticizing Milosevic for kowtowing to US demands. I mean, that's the level of desperation that they were willing to support someone who actually thought that Milosevic shouldn't have surrendered to the US. In order to get rid of him. I mean, and I think that, to this day, you still see the scars all over Serbia. There's, where the remnants of bombed out buildings, or, monuments to where, effectively the NATO, missed a target and ended up killing vast amounts of civilians and destroying, civilian infrastructure. There is, a significant kind of anti-Western, anti-US sentiment within Serbian society. There is a large support for Russia, because, not only because of their deep and coherent historical ties, but for their role in, kind of reining in the KLA. And this is somewhat forgotten, but like there was one EU military official who said that the CIA is incapable of reining in its bastard army. Like the KLA, after having effectively rid Kosovo of its Serbian population, many of whom just kind of live from families who'd lived there for centuries. They then invaded Macedonia. Like there'd been a large amount of refugees from Kosovo who, funnily enough, had fled the NATO bombing and taken up residence in Macedonia, who were then effectively weaponized as kind of like when Israel illegally builds settlements and then post troops there and to protect the new population. They effectively the KLA steamed into Macedonia and said that they were defending their Albanian brothers and sisters from repression from authorities, and they overran a significant proportion of the country. And they were eventually encircled by Macedonian forces, and the US helped evacuate them. I mean, and again, to this day, there are unanswered questions. There are unanswered questions and anomalies within Macedonian society about the kind of level of political representation that its Albanian population should have. So yeah, this is created wide-ranging, and yes, there is significant anti-NATO sentiment in Macedonia, which persists to this day as a result. But you don't hear about any of these things. They are just memory hold, or simply simply never reported on.
Mm. And this is the rather poisonous legacy of what happened back in 1999. We're still living with it to this day. Kit Klarenberg, thank you for joining us for this really interesting discussion over the past hour or so. I think our viewers will have got a hell of a lot out of it. So if people want to find out more about your work and what you've been writing about, where can they go to?
Well, I mean, I'm on Substack, which is just my name, .substack.com. I'm also on Twitter, and I'm publishing regular articles with the Grey Zone and Mint Press, so you can always find my work there.
All right. Well, thank you for your time today.
My pleasure.
Okay.
How was that?
That was excellent, mate. That was excellent.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Sorry. I think, I was